as we move to self-hosted and BYOC, all those little paper cuts really add up, and we're having to retrain ourselves to think about that operator experience.
Howdy, and welcome to Git With It. I'm Grace G, and I'm a partner at Amplify, the first investor for technical founders. Git With It is a show about how great technical products and companies get built. This episode is all about BYOC, or Bring Your Own Cloud. Everyone seems to be talking about BYOC since Databricks stirred up discussion about the idea a few years ago. And for this episode, we have a star-studded cast to go deep on the topic. I'm joined by three founders and leaders in databases. Edo, the co-founder and CEO of Pinecone, Spencer, the co-founder and CEO of Cockroach Labs, and Nikhil, the co-founder and CTO of Materialize. I'm also alongside my partner in crime, Sarah, who led our seed investment in WarpStream. WarpStream's focus on BYOC stirred up the streaming space, which led to them joining Confluent late last year. This conversation touches on whether startups should support BYOC, implementation considerations, what kind of customers want BYOC the most, and how to think about observability, security, unit economics, and metrics. Describe BYOC in your own words. Let's start with Nikhil and end with Edo.
So I like to think of it as a spectrum from self-hosted, where I run your software on my hardware, and totally managed deployments, where you run your software on your hardware. And BYOC is all of that space in the middle, which usually looks something like it usually looks something like you'll run your software on my hardware. But there's a lot of flexibility shifting left and right towards either end of the extreme.
Yeah, we kind of think of it in terms of control planes and data planes in the database space. So with Bring Your Own Cloud, the idea is that you can provide all of the substrate that the real database stuff is running on, but we provide the control plane, which allows you to have visibility into all the databases you're running. We also orchestrate, so kind of send instructions to the data plane in terms of how to run the database, how to expand it, how to contract it, and so forth. So it's just a separation of concerns that allows us to do more for the customer than when they're completely self-hosting it, in Nikhil's words, or we're totally doing a fully managed service. So we'll see what you add to this conversation, but I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's a wide spectrum of definitions here, but for us, and I think what most customers mean by it today when they say bring your own cloud is actually something that looks more like bring your own account. They want to manage their hardware on a public cloud, on one of the hyperscalers, and they want usually only the data plane running in those environments. I think most customers talk about that, at least our customers, that's what they talk about. But of course, it could go all the way to I literally physically bought servers and I'm running them, I'm paying for the electricity, all the way to like you run your managed service and like everything runs in our cloud.
Yeah. One thing we talked about was Databricks kind of being the golden child for BYOC and its success. But CEO Ollie has referenced that he regrets that choice and he wishes that he started with SaaS from day one and didn't explore these like hybrid SaaS architectures. Where is the industry today in terms of BYOC, and what are the two sides of the debate?
Look, I think there are obvious two forces pulling in both directions. One of them, the fully managed, fully hosted, sometimes multi-tenant solution, enjoys ease of use and management, and like you get, and often, especially with Pinecone, I'm sure this is true for you guys too. You get a lot of cost savings because we can bin pack resources a lot better and so on. So that's the benefit of fully managed. And people's expectation, or at least the assumption is that when you run your own cloud, you have full data governance and ownership of the data, and somehow that's more secure, right? My experience, and maybe yours as well, is that companies that run in the cloud run quite literally on the same physical machines that any managed service should run. And so the only difference really is the network definition, the sort of the provisioning within the hyperscalers. And so I think that there is a world when those two things can coexist, and everybody should be very happy with the outcome, but there is some perception and time for this thing to fully mature.
Yeah, industry-wise, I think it's interesting that there's often room for a BYOC player to come online if the existing incumbent doesn't offer BYOC. WarpStream is a great example of this. Confluent did not have a BYOC offering, and then not just WarpStream, but also Red Panda came along, both with BYOC options, and there was enough of a threat there that Confluent ended up acquiring WarpStream. So I think we're going to see increasing pressure across different data technologies for either the incumbents to launch BYOC options, or there's space in the market for a BYOC startup to come and make that their sole offering. With Databricks, we've got Snowflake as the other incumbent there. And what's interesting to me is that they don't have a BYOC option, but they do have virtual private Snowflake, which is pretty close, depending on how you define BYOC. If it's more like BYOA, Snowflake is one step away from that. And I don't know, they might have a BYO account option that's just not publicly disclosed.
Yeah, I think one of the key realizations here for us is that there's no one size fits all in terms of how people want to run databases. So saying that, oh, we're only a fully managed service and we're going to make that so great and everyone's going to come and use it, well, that doesn't necessarily apply to customers that are just very intent on their sort of perspective to run things all themselves, and they have to do it in private data centers, and the idea that you're going to orchestrate into their private data center is far-fetched at best. So it's really important to understand your customer. We find that the real demand for BYOC is from big enterprises. Like, this fits into their perspective on data governance and the compliance regime that they have to operate under. And so, the reality is, does every company need to think about doing BYOC? Not necessarily. You need to really understand your ideal customer profile. If you're playing at the high end of the market, and especially if there's an opportunity because the other incumbents aren't providing BYOC, for sure you're going to find some really big banks and the like that this is the appealing option, might be the only option for them, and trying to force them into a fully managed service where you own the data is a no-go. So you just have to understand the customer, and that's what these decisions need to be based on.
And where are you three today in terms of thinking about whether to support BYOC deployments at your own individual companies? And maybe talk about like any macro trends, AI, multi-cloud that have influenced this decision.
So Materialize today is just a managed service, so we're all the way on one end of the spectrum. We have a self-hosted product under development, which is all the way at the other end of the spectrum. And the reason we decided to build the self-hosted product first is because it gives us essentially full coverage. Anyone who wants BYOC is likely willing to do self-hosted for the right price, for the right size deal, because self-hosted checks all the boxes on the compliance regimes. If they want a particular type of hardware, they have a discount they want. You get all of that with self-hosted, but the problem is now you have to manage that yourself. So we're keeping a close eye to see whether we see interest from customers who want some of the things they get from self-hosted, but not all of them, and we can lower our management burden, improve their uptime by offering BYOC. But we're seeing this primarily as get to the other end of the spectrum, and then see about bringing back a BYOC offering as we get to know our customers better.
So we actually have a little further along, we more started on the self-hosted side. That's where a huge amount of our strength is in terms of our customers and the revenue that we have. We built a fully managed service. It's been a work over the last 6 years or so. It's gaining some traction. We have some really big enterprises on it. But we realized that we've had sort of this dichotomy that's formed in terms of the product experience. Like on one side, our self-hosted product is sort of the core database. It's the thing that most customers are looking for, but we've started to innovate in the cloud. Some of that is like fleet management. So you've got hundreds or thousands of databases. Like, what's your visibility into that? How are you looking at which parts of your organization are using them? Also, we have a serverless capability that allows for virtualized databases and has a much better economic price point. But those are only available in our cloud platform because there's a lot of additional orchestration that's being done there. So what we see is that the BYOC is an opportunity to collapse that, to like really render it a false dichotomy and say that the whole product experience is available even to self-hosted customers, because now we're letting them, as Nikhil said, get most of what they want from self-hosted, but to give them something in addition, which is the better product experience and the orchestration. When you think about the time to value, if a customer doesn't have to learn how to run your software, and by the way, when you start doing virtualization, these other things I'm talking about, there's a lot more complexity in running it, then you can get them to, from having signed a contract to being in production much more quickly. So that's to everyone's benefit.
I mean, our journey has been similar, at least our experiences have been very similar, although we started, and we still are only fully managed. Of course, many customers are asking for self-hosting and all different varieties of it. I do think that especially for us as a new vector, as a vector database, which is a relatively new category, we are discovering new workloads and new optimizations and new ways of saving cost, improving performance, literally on a very, very tight cadence. And our ability to improve and observe and deploy ends up being extremely important for us. And that's why we were able to improve dramatically over the last couple of years. And so for us, once you literally deploy in somebody else's environment, they're locked into a version that you might literally a year later you can barely recognize as your database anymore, because it's evolving so quickly. And so for us, that's again, as database companies are small companies. We're not like tens of thousands of employees. When you start having 50 customers, each one of them with some historic version that you have to figure out how to operate, that becomes a huge burden. And so finding the right balance between management and upgrades, migrations, version management and support and so on, again, for us is still a struggle.
Yeah. Sarah, I wanted to ask you, as the seed investor in WarpStream, how do you think that team and the product that they've built really has changed the industry's conversation around BYOC? And I know you knew Richie 4 to 5 years before he started WarpStream. He was working on a product called Warp Table. Was that related to BYOC at all?
Yeah, so I will start with the second question first. So when I first met Richie, he was actually an engineer at Uber, but on the side, he was working on this project called Warp Table. So this was an observability backend that was really designed to enable developers to kind of collect more data, but do so cheaply. And so the focus was on reducing some of the cost associated with infrastructure, but he had not necessarily architected it as a BYOC system. Now fast forward, I think 4 or 5 years, Richie decides to start WarpStream. And with WarpStream, I think the focus was still on reducing the cost associated with leveraging these types of systems, managing these types of systems. Now, the big cost that Richie was actually focused on initially was interzone networking costs. And so the key idea behind WarpStream was that you could actually obviate the need for these interzone networking costs by connecting directly, writing directly to S3 buckets. So in a way, WarpStream really started out as a BYOB tool, like BYO S3 bucket. I know. Rolls off the tongue. Yeah. So it started off as a BYO bucket tool. Now WarpStream actually had a serverless solution too, but I think what we saw in the early days was that the BYOC solution was gaining more traction. So I can't comment on the Confluent acquisition directly. I wasn't in the room with Jay Krebs when they decided to acquire WarpStream. But what I can say, and I think this actually touches on what Nikhil was mentioning too, I think in conversations with a lot of these incumbents, what we hear is that it is kind of exceedingly difficult to transform an existing solution into a BYOC solution. So basically, like, you need to re-architect your system in order to really deliver upon the BYOC promise. I think, also addressing what Spencer mentioned, there is this expectation that your BYOC system, has the same developer ergonomics, has the same like user experience as a cloud product. And so to do those things, to really deliver upon the user experience, and to re-architect your system such that you can meet that promise, it's hard. And I think for many of the incumbents, it may actually be easier to acquire a new and emerging startup than to start that initiative from scratch.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So many of you have kind of talked about moving to this BYOC model. What do you think that you and your teams need to do to really prepare for this transition? What is it that you need to consider as you have introduced a BYOC system?
I'll just start by saying that we're not moving to a BYOC model. We're of course considering it. We're talking to customers. A lot of people want it. A lot of people want something that they think BYOC is the solution for what they want, but then when you speak with them, they understand that it's not necessarily needed and so on. So we're considering it, we're thinking about it, we're designing for the ability to do that. Just for clarity, we're not moving in that direction. As a company, we're very, very happy with our managed service and our ability to save cost and manage, and we're very, very happy with that strategy. I will say that products that are designed to be run by your customers and products that are designed to be run by you as a vendor, as a software company, are genetically different. They're built from the ground up to be different. We are very happy to introduce complexity. Of course, we hate complexity, but we are very happy to manage a relatively complex system if the result is more stability, better cost structures, and so on, where when a customer runs it, that might be prohibitive, right? And so when one of the things we're doing now is really thinking, okay, what is the most stripped down version of Pinecone look like that a customer can deploy on their own, without all the optimizations, without all the subsystems and so on. And what is that minimal deployment look like that is manageable by a customer? And I think that those discussions are starting to happen. That design is we actually already have some internal designs that achieve that, and I think can be deployed on-prem. But I think that's a big shift. I mean, again, this is sort of maybe you agree or disagree, but tell me what you think. But our experience is those are different products, built differently, designed differently, operate differently, and sort of it's not obvious that one can be run by the other. Like that transition is not also like a fundamental shift to your product.
Well, we went the other direction. So we started self-hosted, and then we were getting huge amounts of pressure from our board, like you have to solve this cloud platform thing. This is like a better multiple on your revenue, and it's faster velocity.
Swap half and half.
Whatever you got, they want the other thing. 5 years apart too, right?
And that's what boards do, right? They give you
the pressure test
advice, to pattern match with like what else is successful, especially when you miss a quarter.
Yeah.
But like, so we actually found exactly the same thing. Different DNA, and we were very good at building a self-hosted product, and it's what our biggest customers and 80% of our revenue was coming from. Meanwhile, we were trying to make the cloud platform, and honestly, we starved it a little bit. We didn't have necessarily, the very, very best of all of our engineers on it because they were focused on the hardcore database internals and things, and it sort of limped along for a bit, and it was, it never really broke out until we were able to just, I guess in the fullness of time, develop it enough and get enough customers on it that started to matter to the revenue and so forth. Now it's humming along quite nicely, but we're not moving to BYOC either, by the way. The right way to think about it is we're accommodating BYOC for a sub-segment of our customer base that seems to desire it. But again, I think that there is an opportunity here that's significant, not just because, okay, well, there's some incremental customers that might want this deployment model. It's more that we can actually, I think, cannibalize our self-hosted customer base and move them into BYOC and give them a better experience, like a better TCO and a better product fundamentally. And I think that part is very exciting. One of the things that we are doing right now, because like 3 years ago, we thought about doing BYOC and we decided, no, we're going to go all in on the fully managed service, because we had someone that came from Databricks and they were like, oh, don't ever do this BYOC thing, it's terrible. We're trying to move away from it at Databricks, right? And Snowflake had such a wonderful model with their fully managed service, and that's really what they stuck to, their guns on that. So we decided at that time to just focus on the fully managed service. But, so we are where we are in 2024 now. The big thing we're doing is we're going and talking. I mean, we talk to these guys. What they're thinking is we're talking to, Richie at WarpStream and, quite a few others besides. Talking to the folks at Confluent in terms of they have a huge customer base. Like, what do they think about this and so forth? So we're trying to just learn as much as we can so that the strategy we have avoids some of the, I'm sure, pitfalls that we would stumble into if we just kind of, design this from first principles all in a silo. So that's sort of where we are right now. It's just, again, it's realizing an opportunity inherent in our customer base, I think, and probably some incremental customers, but it's really, we have these huge customers, they're running it all on their own. And sometimes they even built a whole database as a service internally, right? And that's a long process. It's from zero to production is a multi-year process. So we can really improve that.
One of the things that's been most frustrating for me looking at architecturally, how do we make Materialize support self-hosted in BYOC, is that when you zoom out, it's so simple. We have a cellular architecture, so we have a global control plane, and we try to put as little as possible in that global control plane because it'll be a choke point as we scale. And then each cell has its own control plane, and then within each cell there's a data plane as well. And when we do the multi-tenant managed service offering, we have multiple data planes within each cell and one control plane. And for BYOC, all you have to do at this very high level is you take the cell and you put it in the customer's cloud account. And in theory, this would be a drop-in. We use Pulumi, but it's like Terraform for anyone who's unfamiliar with Pulumi. You just run that Pulumi up command inside of a customer's account instead of Materialize's account, and you're done. But the devil's in the details in the ways that you guys have been describing. We don't have the self-hosted and BYOC DNA right now. We don't think about I'll call it the operator experience, the user experience of operating Materialize, because we take on all of that pain ourselves. We don't put a lot of thought into our log messages and our metrics today because we can fix all of that in post. We have developers who understand what metrics to look at and which ones are worthless. And it's not worth the time to go remove the bad log lines and remove the bad metrics because we just filter them out. They don't show up in the Grafana dashboards. But when you hand that same product to a customer who's going to self-host, they say, I don't know what to do with all these metrics. Why do you have 10,000 of these? Just give me the metrics I care about. Or, hey, this error says something's gone terribly wrong. What do I do about this? And we have to explain to them, no, that error doesn't actually matter. It's this info log that says everything's fine that's actually the source of your problem. And you learn all these things when you operate the system internally, and it's not worth fixing them when you're doing a fully managed service. But as we move to self-hosted and BYOC, all those little paper cuts really add up, and we're having to retrain ourselves to think about that operator experience.
So, one thing that you said before, Nikhil, what you just implied is that, as you shift from kind of a cloud product on this one end of the spectrum to BYOC or, to a self-hosted solution, you're basically transitioning some of the complexity to the customer. So presumably then, the customer needs to be prepared to take on, some of that complexity. How do you think the customers of BYOC or self-hosted products can really prepare to make that deployment model a success? Like what is it that they need to do?
They need to do a lot, but also the companies who run it need to do a lot. I think, again, there's the DNA of the software, but there's also the DNA of the company that changes, okay? Their infra folks, okay, now need to not manage a managed service, but rather literally spin up machines and monitor and read logs and effectively become what our support, what Pinecone's support or observability or on-call does, right? So we have to train them to be that, right? Same for support, same for escalations and so on. If there is a customer escalation for an actual issue, right? Now our support, because we would have our support working with them, right? Our support needs to do what today my engineers do, because anything that's actually happening in the core system, the people who run it, it's one big managed service, it's the engineers running it and so on. So there's like a whole sort of musical chairs of skills that happens between what do core engineers do, what does support do, what does how does sales look like, whatever. All that shifts around. The skill, again, the skill set for the customer specifically that runs these, again, if this is a big enterprise that is used to running their own, whatever, everything operates on-prem for them, then usually they have those skills. But then again, this is, it depends again on the software. I mean, it's something that's designed from the ground up to be sort of managed this way, then I don't know if they need new skills per se, right? But it definitely looks very, very different than using even a partially managed service.
Yeah, I think your DNA comment is correct. I mean, it's a mindset shift because they're used to running everything themselves and kicking over nodes, and ultimately, they're responsible in self-hosted. I mean, they might get mad at us and provide, a huge string of support tickets, and we've got to help them solve whatever's gone wrong in their environment. But it's pretty clear where the separation of responsibility lies. But once you get into this BYOC thing, then things can get kind of confused. Right, because they still can go in there and kick over nodes and suspend a process and try to solve things on their own. But if that interferes with the orchestration, then whose fault was it when the thing experiences an outage? So it is there's a little bit of a no man's land in where the vendor and the customer come together in BYOC, that I think they just have to kind of wrap their heads around that, because it's not self-hosted, and if they treat it that way, then the orchestration will stop being effective, and you might have worse, more difficult to debug problems on your hands.
I'll add to that, specifically for databases, where the thing that we are measured on is uptime and stability, right? That, for me, again, as a CEO, that deploying sort of beyond the wall, right? And so hoping for the best is anxiety inducing, right? And again, if a customer, whatever, and just somebody goes in and changes some permission somewhere and suddenly, whatever, that thing messes up whatever, it doesn't even have to be something severe, but something goes, starts limping, right? If you have, as a provider, if you don't have any visibility or access to it, that might go on for hours or days sometimes, right? Unless you jump, whatever, that becomes a very, very different kind of interaction. And again, this is, goes to your comment, where does the responsibility lie and exactly how that works? And so, again, it goes back to the different DNA. It's the whole company needs to operate in this mode for this to work well, in my opinion.
Just to jump in on Spencer's comment, because the responsibility boundaries are so blurred, how do you make them more clear from both your team's perspective as well as the customers?
Well, I think you need to put the guardrails up, and part of that is, here are the recommendations, and they're not, I think there's almost contractual recommendations, right? This is the type of node you want to run. These are the permissions it needs. Don't change these things. The other side of it is, can you create the apparatus that allows you to debug when something does go wrong? And so that also is, what information is shared from that account. Like you do want to create these hooks where you can get information about the permissions and about the amount of disk space and things like that. So if you can design things so it's really blind from the orchestration layer, or you can create enough bidirectional communication that you might have a good shot at saying, hey, whoa, you don't have enough disk space on this, or something just changed, this particular role that's running the process, something changed in it. But that may or may not be possible. That's where the devil is in the details, 100%. Like it's just, and it gets worse. I think we're mostly here talking about bring your own cloud account, which is, okay, we're going to orchestrate for you in a very familiar environment where our fully managed service is used to running Cockroach. So we can do it on Azure, GCP, AWS. We do it, in Cockroach's case, we actually create a new account, a sub-account on our account for every customer. So them bringing us their account is, in principle, or theory at least, it's should be really easy for us to run Cockroach, right? It's all the same stuff. We have S3, we've got EBS underneath, we've got all the, the APIs are the same that the database needs in order to orchestrate. And yet, the more complex thing, which some of our customers undoubtedly are interested in, we have customers that, for example, want to run across private data center and public cloud 1 and public cloud 2. So they're going to have 3 replication sites that are all totally different technologies, right? And how do we do that? Well, then we actually have to create like an API for the data plane that says, hey, here's how you get a persistent disk, or like some sort of disk that it can write to. Here's how you send certain kinds of information back. This is what an S3 thing is supposed to look like, or a bucket for backups or something like that. And that might be Ceph on some OpenStack private cloud environment, right? So then, boy, I mean, you have a professional services task of implementing that API in order to orchestrate a completely idiosyncratic, unique data plane in a customer environment. And so they would, implement all of those stubs, and then you could orchestrate it. If they didn't implement all of them, maybe you could only orchestrate partial functionality for the cluster. But you can imagine that those implementations could be wrong. Right? And so wow, there's sort of this exponential explosion of all the different things that might not work, but it's an extremely valuable product to deliver. Can you run a Cockroach cluster in a hybrid environment where the customer is able to, for example, have clusters of Cockroach that are running specifically in one cloud vendor, or across all 3 cloud vendors, or in a private data center only next to a mainframe, or you get the idea. But like having all of that orchestrated through one pane of glass has tremendous value to a customer. So when you see those hard things and the customers really dearly want to do them, it's a good thing to figure out how to do if you can. It makes your product very valuable and gives you a good moat.
Yeah. I think it all points towards, we don't, as an industry, yet know what people want out of BYOC. For some people, it's just, I negotiated a really good discount with AWS, and I want to apply that discount to the infrastructure that you're going to run on my behalf, so put it in my AWS account. But other than that, I want a managed service experience. And then there's the other end of the spectrum of, I have a private data center, and I would like you to do as much of the hard work of running your software in that data center as you can, but I really need tight control over it, or I have all these compliance requirements, and I need to be able to see everything that you're doing so that I can ascertain that you are following the regulations that I have to live under. And almost every customer that we talk to has a slightly different set of concerns that they care about. And it's been hard to zero in on one particular product offering that we could build that would satisfy most of our customers' needs. So that's what I'm most excited about. As this conversation continues, hopefully we can coalesce on 1 or 2 different set points in the middle of this spectrum instead of meaning 15 different things when we say BYOC.
It's a cost-benefit analysis for sure. Yeah. And each of these different sort of phases you might imagine to a completely arbitrary BYOC definition. The bring your own cloud account feels like it has a lot going for it.
Yeah, I'll go even further and say that we now offer customer managed encryption keys and VPC peering and RBAC of all sorts and so on. And at some point, like this is when the customer understands that they are really in full control, that they really operate in the same VPC, they really, the second they revoke access, what Pinecone has is a sack of bits that is completely useless, right? And so they feel in control, because like, what is it? You explain how everything is just as secure, or maybe even more secure than their own cloud. Because again, if we have to jump in and start, jump with a machete into their own environment, I'm like, I wouldn't want a vendor to do that in my environment. So I'm like, do you want us to have access to your stuff? It's like, no, okay, so don't put us stuff like, so I think there, even with the fully managed experience that we have today, which has already most of the security trappings in place and even more coming up, most of the customers that I speak with that start with like fully dug in, only bring your own cloud, only maybe would consider bringing their own account, but not anymore. And after like 20 minutes of talking, they're like, okay, you know what? Actually, that's fine. Okay. In fact, this is kind of checks all the managed service checks all the boxes. Not everybody. You will have whatever. You will have your own, the DoD or whatever coming back to you. It's like no cigar, but okay. I mean, this is that's going to happen. But again, I think as a whole, the industry is shifting towards more services, more support, more management. Because people understand that owning their own stuff is and managing it and being on the hook for fixing it and so on is actually very expensive and hard, and expensive not only in dollars of like people working on it, expensive in outages, expensive in uptime and so on. Where something goes wrong, in our service, we jump on it and you might have my whatever. This is fixed in minutes and not in hours or days sometimes when you run your own thing.
I think we already touched upon this a little bit, but again, we have the spectrum from self-hosted to a fully managed service. Some customers are going to want, more control. BYOC specifically may be a reasonable alternative in certain contexts for them. But what are the other alternatives? Like, what else kind of exists in the mid-range of this spectrum?
Again, there's everything in between. I mean, I can go through the gamut. There's literally most of Pinecone's customers run in our account managed by us. We can manage it in a separate account that we share only with them. We can deploy it in a separate account that they spin up for us, so it's the same, but they pick up the bill. We can spin it up in a physical, like whatever. Like there's a whole spectrum. I don't know if.
Yeah. By the way, in fully managed, you can also virtualize, right? You can be like DynamoDB, so it's like a shared physical cluster with multiple organizations that could potentially impact each other, and that's why that's not always the first choice for customers. But there's just so many different flavors here.
Yeah. And it plays into the multi-tenant versus single tenant as well, because you can have the multi-tenant shared DynamoDB style service, and then you can slice off a single tenant piece of that. But then there's a question of how much are you slicing off? Is it just the data plane, or is it the data plane and the control plane? And then you can pull that data plane into someone else's cloud account that they control, or you could put it in an account that you control, and then maybe you want to pull the control plane with that as well. So there's these two different dimensions, and basically the data plane and the control plane can either be multi-tenant or single tenant in your account or in my account. I think that's a reasonably good approximation of what the possibility space here looks like. When you're only thinking about running in cloud accounts, and then there's the stuff that
and there's public and private and hybrid and everything in between.
Yeah,
there's all kinds of exotic hardware too that people want us to run on, including mainframes.
In fact, I think the moment that I knew that I wanted to invest in anything that Richie built, not WarpStream specifically, was when he told me that he spends a lot of time thinking about all of the databases that he could build if he only had access to his Xbox hardware.
Is the total cost of ownership under BYOC actually cheaper? Walk me through the cost-benefit analysis from the customer's point of view, and also yours.
The main consideration we have right now when bringing a new customer onto our managed service is whether we can put them in one of our existing regions. We run in 3 AWS regions, or whether it would be required to turn on a brand new region with the multi-tenant architecture in place. And that's really expensive for us. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars a year baseline for us to run a region. So if we can't fill that region up with lots of customers, the economies of scale do not help, and we end up losing money. So with BYOC and self-hosted, there's an interesting opportunity here that we actually, as the vendor, get to push a lot of those fixed costs onto the end customer. And that's enabled us to immediately unlock some potential deals with folks who are on GCP or Azure, where we don't yet have a presence, or just other AWS regions where we don't have enough demand to justify us bearing all of those fixed costs to turn on that region. But the flip side of that is, as a prospective self-hosted or BYOC customer of Materialize, you're going to take on a large share of those fixed costs, because unless you grow your usage of Materialize massively, you're not going to get the same economies of scale that we get when we have lots of customers running in the same region. We're still at the beginning stages of this exploration, so we haven't done the full cost assessment, but the fixed costs are definitely smaller when you're a self-hosted customer than they are for us, because we've been able to eliminate a lot of the shared services and do some re-architecture to bring costs down. But yeah, it's certainly more expensive than using our managed offering as the end customer, and that's not even accounting for the cost of support and the cost of having an engineering on-call rotation on your side to keep things online. I don't know if either of you have thought more about that aspect of the TCO with BYOC.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's going to be considerably better for the customer, especially since some of our customers do their own internal database as a service, which is a whole team spun up to build these things, or to integrate Cockroach as another database choice within their existing database as a service. But you have to find Cockroach expertise, right? You have to hire essentially administrators, and you have your own first line of support and things like that. A lot of that, I think, can be tackled by a good BYOC offering. Then I also mentioned that we can give a better product experience, which certainly has some value. For example, using the virtualization, the multi-tenant capability of Cockroach allows, I think, Cockroach to be economically delivered for non-mission critical workloads, where you don't mind having lots of virtual clusters on the same physical hardware, and so the peaks and the troughs balance out, and you can drive a much higher utilization. I think that's how most of these fully managed services that are well architected already run, but you can kind of deliver that to the customer and also deliver some capabilities. And the other big thing, which I think has been mentioned here, is that you can help the customer avoid downtime with the economies of scale, or maybe the expertise that you have in the orchestration, the tools you have, building your own database as a service, and responding to any kinds of outages or auto scaling requirements and things like that is a lot. It took us a long time to build these things, and we're constantly iterating on them to solve the problems for hundreds of customers. That actually can certainly play to the benefit of anyone in a BYOC engagement with us or deployment. We're actually able to deliver all of those capabilities and avoid common, or maybe not so common, long tail sorts of problems that can lead to downtime. And we've just seen that we actually did this. I'll do a short plug. We did this state of resilience report. We do one of these things every year. We kind of look at multi-cloud and cloud costs and things like that. This is about resilience, and we surveyed about 1,000 different sort of CIO types from enterprise customers around the world, and it's something like $498,000 is the average cost of a downtime, and customers report having an average about 96 of these a year. Wow. So yeah, those numbers seem like ridiculous, eye-watering, but most companies are really struggling with that problem. And so I think there's this opportunity to save money just by having better resilience. It's part of Cockroach's promise, of course, but it's also one of the promises of BYOC. If you really need to do self-hosted for whatever reasons, BYOC is an opportunity to share some of the economies of scale that Cockroach has in running many customer, thousands and thousands of customer deployments of Cockroach. We can now bring those learnings to all of our self-hosted customers.
I really like that framing because resilience is built one incident at a time. And if you go with the BYOC offering, you get to learn from all the other customers' incidents. You don't have to have those incidents yourself in order to build that expertise. In theory, it should be possible to do with self-hosting as well if Cockroach were able to package up the orchestration and hand it off. But I think in practice, at least what we see at Materialize is with self-hosting, customers keep that knowledge to themselves because it's walled off, it's air-gapped. You never even know that they had an incident in some cases. But with BYOC, the hope is that you would, as the vendor, see every one of those incidents and bake the fixes into the orchestration that you're delivering to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, the orchestration is one part of it, and it's super important, but it's also the orchestrators that are looking at the orchestration, right? And that's where,
The humans,
the humans that we train are definitely, they see a lot, right? They've seen all the good, the bad, and the ugly, and they've seen the long tail, and they've worked through these problems endlessly, and so that institutional knowledge is concentrated within Cockroach Labs. And so, even if we repackage that, I think we'd still have a bigger support burden than if our orchestration is run, with Cockroach human beings that are, very knowledgeable.
Yeah.
I'll just maybe add the obvious, that there's all the cost of outages, the cost of people, the cost of, all these are real heavy costs. There's also just the fundamentals of just the math of utilization of hardware, which unless you have a very stable, very well understood, large workload, you're not going to be able to saturate hardware in any reasonable way. And so either you are sort of like signing up for running your servers at like 20% capacity and sort of like taking a 5x on your cost just because you don't care, right? Or you really need to have something manage all of that and pack them much more neatly and really worry about utilization. And so again, in the managed service, you can, at least at Pinecone, you can run a query and get maybe 100 CPUs for 50 milliseconds, and those 100 CPUs are serving something else like 50 milliseconds later, right? And you might run a query every 5 minutes or every 2 seconds or 10 a second, it doesn't really matter, right? But we find that people who have their own clusters, and we started in this dedicated nodes setting, we just found that becomes too expensive to people because they just can't saturate them. So it becomes like a infinite dance of, I want the same machine but with less disk, less memory, more network, whatever. And so you end up trying to fit the shape of the machine to the shape of the workload. And at some point that runs its course. But when you have a managed service that manages thousands of customers, you can do that math on behalf of the customers and make sure that your machines are utilized, and as a result, you can roll those savings to customers.
How does that play with BYOC?
It doesn't.
Is there some way to
You can, for very large customers, deploy the whole managed service software that does all of that together, right? And if they themselves have like 30, 40 different big applications running and they all share hardware, then somehow you can start to gain some of that. But again, that's another layer of complexity that a lot of people are even more reluctant to manage.
And it's really turtles all the way down too, because under the hood it's EC2 instances, which most of the time are virtualized themselves. So even if you're running all of this yourself on your own servers, it's probably just a fraction of some real machine that's running in an AWS data center with who knows what other workloads on it.
Correct. And then everybody's like, it's my cluster, but then it's S3 at the bottom. We guess S3 is multi-tenant too,
Right.
Like this is like, it's like, oh, I'll
Yeah, I think it all comes back
everything.
to trust at the end of the day. Which vendors do you trust with their virtualization? And every now and then you'll see an industry or a customer that's big enough where they really want their own data center, like hiring their own security guards and putting them in their own buildings that they're building. But short of that, most people are just litigating varying degrees of trust.
It is definitely a lesson in there for startups or growth companies, stage companies. Just we had this experience where we had a customer that wanted to use our fully managed service, and we got pretty far down the road with them, and then they asked us some question which is a little atypical, I think, for people that were interested in fully managed service in the first place, which is there any way for Cockroach to see the data that we have? And the answer is yeah, there are some circumstances where that is the case. And they said, well, that's not acceptable, we're gonna have to self-host it. But we said, well, AWS can see the same thing, and you're using their various services, and they're like, well, that's AWS, and you're a smaller vendor. Yeah. And so, yeah, the BYOC thing, it definitely can help if you're the kind of startup or high growth company that really is trying to break into the enterprise. You do realize that they're just, it's not exactly irrational, but there are some long tail requirements there that the bigger the customer, the more you see those.
And oftentimes just the use of those processes and what people do in the big clouds is not any better, if oftentimes much worse.
But my point about those economies of scale and things like they do, like each of the cloud vendors is an excellent technical monoculture. Right? They just have like so much experience with these things, and they have great best practices, and they're able to apply those, at a fraction of the cost on a per unit basis, right? For a growth stage company to get the same expertise, I mean, the investment would be enormous compared to the revenue.
Actually, I'm not sure I agree with that.
Really?
Yeah.
Just do you think they have too much complexity, too many things going on?
Yeah, you might. I used to work at AWS. I have many friends there.
Okay. You got the inside track here.
No, but you might be running 12 different versions going back like 7 years, and you might have still a fairly small team, and that small team has rotation. Like people, very few people work for 20 years at AWS, so like half the team is new, and there's the two guys that are here for 3 years and they remember stuff, and so it's not magic. At the end of the day, it's people and engineers and software. It's not
right. But tools and processes do go a long way.
You'll be shocked at how many times people just literally SSH into a customer machine to go and figure out what the hell's happening, which is to me a travesty. I'm like, what? This is not.
Well, there's the time when I worked at Google back in the aughts, and every engineer had like root access to all the machines.
Exactly. It's like,
but then that changed, and it changed dramatically. They don't have anything like that anymore.
That sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah.
So we had talked a little bit about what happens if there is some sort of like issue or outage, and the fact that this is more challenging as you shift towards the BYOC model. So, how do you think companies should be approaching BYOC from an observability perspective? How do they need to be thinking about their logs and metrics and so on and so forth?
I so want this to be somebody else's problem. And what I mean by that is it feels like there's a real opportunity here for some company to come along and package up the standard observability tools that we have today in a way that handles sensitive customer data according to the requirements of BYOC. We have logs, we have metrics, we have traces for Materialize. I think we can live without traces because there's way too much data in them. But for logs and for metrics, I wish there were someone out there that would show us the way on how to safely handle those, redact the sensitive bits, and ship them off to our cloud. I know Cockroach has a bunch of logging libraries internally where you mark what's sensitive and what's not in each log message, and then depending on the context, you either show or don't show the sensitive pieces of that information. We are looking into building the same thing at Materialize, but it feels like something that not every vendor that wants to do a BYOC offering should be reinventing.
Cockroach's stuff is right there in GitHub. So
it's only Go, unfortunately.
He used to work at Cockroach, disclaimer here, so he probably wrote some of that stuff.
Yeah.
We actually have an interesting perspective because most of our business is still self-hosted, by fraction. And self-hosted, whatever problems you can imagine BYOC has with debugging and customer responsibility and things, self-hosted has them, at least as bad, or at least as difficult. I think there was the problem I mentioned before around just who's responsible is worse with BYOC, or it's more complicated at least. So we do have a lot of tools for helping customers debug. I'll tell you, it's much easier when you have the fully managed experience for the customer and for the vendor to debug it more quickly. We have definitely a faster time to resolution on issues in our managed service, because we can go in there and we can see a lot more signals. And just to give you an idea of how many signals there are to look at, we have this thing where if a self-hosted customer has a problem, we ask them to generate what we call a debug.zip. And it's like a multi-hundred gigabyte, I think. It's not megabyte, it's huge. It's this gigantic artifact that the cluster will generate that has like every time series and every bit of log and all the different nodes and how the networks are working between them and everything. And it's completely comprehensive. And then we get that thing delivered, and it's we have to take extraordinary care to redact everything according to like these different rules and guardrails and things. And then the support engineers will dig through that and figure out what the hypotheses are, and will work to solve it. It's amazing that it works at all, right? But I'll just say that having operated in that world, we're not too afraid of BYOC. But if you're coming from the fully managed world, then just going to BYOC is a huge expansion of concern in terms of like the difficulty of debugging and helping customers.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I agree with it. It's magic that it works at all, right? Because there's there's the computational theories about human subconscious, okay? But then when you look at it computationally, it's obvious that machines have like a subconscious too, in the sense that they can't be fully reflexive. They can't know everything about themselves. At the end of the day, you can't have a log message for every assembler command. At some point, things just need to run, and you lose the effort of logging and remembering and being self-reflexive becomes more effort than the thing you're trying to do. And at some point, that runs its course. So logging, monitoring, observability, and knowing what's happening in the system only goes so deep. At some point, the code needs to just run, and you have to just assume it runs. And so, yes, if somebody I don't know, like stopped a machine, like critical machine, and sure, that's fine, or whatever. Like somebody resized disk and that went awry somehow. Sure, you can have those that you can monitor, and then you can solve those problems. But you will, in my experience, you will always run into issues that no matter how much monitoring you have, you will never get them. And frankly, even when you figure them out, just like wrecking your brains on what the hell's happening and reproducing might take days, because like it's such a weird set of sequences, the consequences that triggers something. So I agree that maybe 95% or some big fraction of problems can be solved at the monitoring magic solved. But with software, I think in general, you will always get to the point where somebody needs to just really dive in and solve a problem like with their hands. Otherwise, you'll never get it.
Back to Spencer's point. Oh, so I was just going to say, back to Spencer's point on root access and SSH aging into a customer's VPC. What else are you guys asking for on the customer side? Commonly, we hear vendors ask for just-in-time access, audit logging, recovery plans. What else is there?
I'm probably not the right person to ask that because I am, for better or worse, I'm not very close to actually debugging these customer problems anymore. It's been the better part of a decade since it was, which I think is probably mostly for the better all around. But this guy probably knows.
What we're looking at is getting as much access as we can that doesn't compromise on the comfort and control that customers are looking for with BYOC. So we'll take the logs and metrics if we can get them. We'll take the ability to do break glass SSH access to the machines if we can get it. We'll take the ability to get all of the remote debugging capabilities that may be present. There's actually an Amplify portfolio company, SideEye, that I'm excited about. I think they're still pretty far away from being usable in a BYOC context, but I think there's real potential there because their whole product is you have running software. You didn't put the log line in that you needed or the metric in that you needed, but you know if you could just see the value of some variable somewhere, you'd be able to get to the heart of the issue, and you can dynamically add a probe to say, I need to know what this variable is at this moment. And right now, I believe they're just going after self-hosted and managed services, but ultimately I can imagine customers being much more comfortable with that kind of remote debugging where you can see, oh, the engineer was evaluating an incident and they got the value of this variable at this time. And not that anybody's going to be actively monitoring that, but after the fact, if there's a security incident, if you can see, oh, Materialize accessed my environment, but they didn't just get all of the logs or all of the metrics. They saw just a couple pieces of information that they needed. I think customers could be much more comfortable with that. But there's just such a universe of tooling that needs to be built before we get to that point. And I think the short term looks a lot more like this other company called Nuon that's trying to help startups like Materialize do BYOC offerings by providing some guardrails and frameworks for what kind of information you get, how you do the deployments, and then they can do some of the hard work of providing customers with audit logs of what's happening and when. So I think something like Nuon, even if it doesn't end up being retrofittable to database companies that are as established as ours, is going to really set the standard for the next generation of BYOC-enabled companies.
There was a moment where I was like, we don't have a portfolio company called SideEye. We don't.
Data ex machina.
But it's their product, yes.
Yes. This is the BPF one with Andre.
This is Andre and Andrew, yeah.
I'm an
Their
investor.
former Cockroach.
Yeah.
So some of our portfolio companies are thinking about launching a BYOC solution. They've not yet seen, the ways in which outages happen or failures occur. What should they be doing to prepare? What should they be doing so that, if an issue arises, they actually can, debug it, or so that they can anticipate such failures?
The quote that comes to mind is the one about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And the goal is always, how do you get the known unknowns to be as large as possible? There's a certain amount that you just have to learn by putting your software into the world and seeing what comes back. But I think the more access you can get in those early days, the better. So having the ability to break glass and SSH in. We were talking to a vendor that has a very well-established BYOC deployment model. I don't know that I'm allowed to share what vendor it is, but I was shocked at the level of access they have. They have teleport on basically every deployment, which lets them SSH in, and they get all of the logs and metrics over the public internet. Their agents are running and ships all of that back. So I was pretty blown away by how permissive most of their BYOC customers were. So that would be my recommendation to a startup just getting into the space. Go out, talk to those vendors, and see if your customers are willing to let you get that much access. Because if they are, you'll be in much better shape when those unknown unknowns present themselves.
There's probably an opportunity to have a spectrum of access, and you it's an opt-out, right? So
Yeah.
when you sell a BYOC engagement, it contemplates the maximum permissive environment for debugging. And then, but you're not trying to hide that. You say, this is what we do. And they say, ooh, that's, too much. And you say, okay, well, we'll cut back that. Because you can imagine that you try to provide maximum unpermissiveness to everything just on the belief that that's the principled thing to do. But then you're going to have an extraordinarily difficult time supporting all of those customers, whereas most customers are like, well, that's fine, you can do that. And it's only a small, fraction that are demanding, a very specific and limited amount of communication from the data plane back up to the control plane.
Cockroach really took the hard path there. by starting with the least amount of access and then slowly adding back.
Certainly did.
Yeah.
There's another thing to the point of like, how do you prepare? And it's like, okay, well, you're doing all of these debugging on the clusters that you have, for example, in your fully managed service. Okay, well, every time you find one of these longer tail, because it's always a longer tail beyond what you've ever experienced, every time you find a new one, you have to engage the people that solve the problem in your observability teams to say, how can we make this so that when this recurs, we have transparency in the visualizations of the metrics and things.
What tool were you missing that would have gotten you to this answer faster?
You just have like, hey, there's this thing wrong with the cluster. It shows up in like big red on the like console page, right? Or it's like, how do we eliminate whole classes of problems? That's like another really important one. Like, okay, we had this, and how do we make it so that not just this, but like other things that we can imagine that might be sort of like this could just never happen again, because we're going to put in something that obviates that as a potential problem. So you have to just, if you approach every problem you solve like that, instead of just like, okay, we solved that, okay, now we got the next one. If you're not reflective on what you can change in the system, then you're missing a huge opportunity. Those things will they'll make a huge difference if that's the approach you take as you're debugging when you have the control and the access.
Are you guys following DST, deterministic simulation testing? The buzz that Antithesis is creating? The Foundation DB guys went out and started a company called Antithesis based on the way that they tested Foundation DB, which is basically to make every single part of your database mockable so that you can do these deterministic simulations. You mock out the disk, you mock out the network, you mock out the clock, and that way, when you find a bug, you can trace that exact same path of execution through the database and reproduce it, which means your ability to figure out the cause is vastly enhanced.
But I assume only in a testing environment.
Yes, the test has to find the bug, but once that test finds the bug once, it can find it every time thereafter because it records the execution trace. Antithesis is trying to retrofit this approach onto existing software systems, but if you start a database ground up, you can build it with DST enabled from day one, and you can run millions of simulations over the course of an hour and really explore the whole possibility space. So I think there's something really interesting happening there, but it requires completely changing how we as a database community develop software. That doesn't happen overnight. But I think in 10 years' time, we will be looking at a new wave of DST-enabled databases that simply have fewer bugs.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of TDD in certain ways, but certainly is a trend that I think we're seeing more and more of. In fact, one of Amplify's more recent database investments was in a company called Tiger Beetle, which adopted a similar approach of starting out by building the simulation engine and then developing the database around it.
Yeah, I'll just say that again. My experience might be. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from what you said, but the real thorny issues come when you run at massive scale, right? And so when you have 10,000 customers at massive scales, and whatever, like that environment might cost you $10,000, whatever, every day or every few hours or whatever. I don't know about you, but I'm not, like, we don't have the budget to run those tests.
Neither do we.
Like, we can't simulate a region for a month to figure out there is we're just not going to be able to afford it, right? And so, and regardless, you're not going to be able to simulate some super intricate, like, noisy neighbor issue with some, like, subsystem and so on. I think, yes, we should debug in the best possible way and simulate and so on. At the end of the day, it comes back to just having operated the system for many years and having the DNA and having the scars to prove that you've fixed all these like really edge cases, one day at a time. And that's why databases take a decade to mature, because it's that.
And to be clear, Materialize followed that traditional path. We are learning one paper cut, one outage at a time. Exactly. But
it's every bit as painful every time, and unfortunately, I don't think it's our for better or for worse, our moat as a database is our blood and sweat and tears. Yeah. That's our moat.
There's truth in that for sure. Yeah.
I will say though, when I talk to the Foundation DB folks, every one of them that I've ever met has said it was different. And there's something that happened there. The experience of building and operating that database does seem to be an order of magnitude different relative to the standard painful experience, enough that I'm willing to overcome that hurdle of no. I've just talked to enough people now that I feel like they can't all be lying to me. But yeah, we'll see. I wish to one day work on a system that I say that about.
Any last words for teams or vendors thinking about BYOC deployment?
I would just say both for people building technologies and for people who consume technologies, think very deeply whether that's absolutely needed and how to do that, because it's very easy to be led astray either by your own data governance or security team, or by investors, or by a few customers, and sort of make myopic decisions. Those are significant decisions to make, especially when you develop your own software, but also when you consume it. So I'll just stop here.
Well, I think depending on the timing, if someone's listening to this and they would like to explore BYOC in about a quarter, 2 quarters, come talk to me. I can at least tell you what we screwed up and where things went well, and I'd be happy to share the advice, because we're doing that tour right now ourselves.
Yeah, I'll +1 that.
I was initially a BYOC skeptic. Approaching it from first principles doesn't lead you to BYOC as the right answer. And one of the things that I've learned is approaching this with more curiosity about what is it that you're getting out of BYOC has led to some really interesting insights. So as we've started to explore self-hosted and BYOC at Materialize, we've taken that approach to try to really understand what is it that customers need. And we're really hoping that gets us to a type of BYOC architecture that's meaningfully better for us and for our customers. And all sorts of interesting ideas about the shared ownership, taking responsibility for the on-call, bringing down the cost to the customer, improving uptime, things like moving the COGS from your books to the customer's books. There's all sorts of interesting insights that exploration has surfaced. So I'd encourage anyone else who's skeptical about BYOC to really follow what customers are asking for and what vendors are getting out of it, because there are some interesting things there, even if on its surface it feels like BYOC is a bit suspect. Yeah,
there's something you just said bears a little bit of a double click, and that's talk to your finance professionals about BYOC, because there are different ways to think about that revenue and to structure like what the service actually does that can make a huge difference in terms of what you're reporting in later years.
Well, thanks for joining us today, and I'm excited to check back in a quarter or two and hear the scar tissues that you've had in the BYOC journey.
How about like transcendent joy?
Joy.
Exactly.